The air in Coldwater Bluff had teeth. It was the kind of late-afternoon cold that sank deep into the bone, a damp, clinging chill that promised a brutal November. Wet snow, heavy as paste, coated the needles of the lodgepole pines, bowing their branches in silent surrender. The wind, when it stirred from the north, carried the sharp, clean scent of pine resin and a colder, harder smell beneath it, the scent of frost on iron. It was the smell of a world shutting down, battening its hatches for the long, white siege of a Montana winter. Against this vast, indifferent landscape, Marin O'Hara was a small, stubborn defiance. 8 months into her pregnancy, she moved with the deliberate, aching slowness of a woman carrying both a child and the weight of a world she was building with her own 2 hands. The cabin was a skeleton of desapped pine, its walls only half risen, a testament to a fight waged against time and gravity. Each log had been felled, stripped, and notched by her. The ache was a permanent resident in the small of her back, a fire that smoldered and flared with every lift, every twist. Her hands, once soft, were now a cartographer's map of her labor, blistered, calloused, with fine, dark lines of dirt and pine tar etched into every crease. Splinters were a constant, unwelcome intimacy. Yet, when she paused to push a stray strand of auburn hair from her face, her eyes were the one part of her that betrayed no fatigue. They were a clear, startling blue, the color of a winter sky after a storm, and they held a fierce, unwavering resolve. She was fitting a smaller log into a gap in the western wall, her shoulder pressed against the rough bark for leverage, when a flicker of movement at the tree line caught her eye. It was a man on horseback, a figure so still and dark against the snow-laden pines that he seemed less a visitor and more a piece of the wilderness that had detached itself and drifted closer. He sat his mount, a powerful roan with steam pluming from its nostrils, with an ease that spoke of a lifetime in the saddle. He was a silhouette of solitude, the wide brim of his hat shadowing his face, his posture one of patient observation. The quiet that surrounded him wasn't empty. It felt earned, settled, the product of long years and longer silences. This was Judah Renshaw, a man whose name was as rooted in this territory as the ancient pines, as the owner of the Double Bar R, a sprawling ranch on Ash Needle Ridge to the north. His presence here was an anomaly, an intrusion. His land was miles away. This small parcel, clinging to the bluff above the creek, was hers. She'd filed the claim in Bitter Juniper Creek with the last of her money, the paper a thin shield against the world. He nudged the roan forward, the horse's hooves making soft, deep impressions in the new snow. He didn't ride directly at her, but skirted the edge of the clearing she had made, his approach respectful, almost hesitant. He stopped a good 20 paces from the unfinished cabin, dismounting in a single, fluid motion. The creak of his saddle leather was loud in the profound quiet. Marin let the log settle into its place. She didn't reach for the rifle leaning against the wall frame, not yet, but her body tensed, her hand resting protectively over the hard swell of her belly. She watched him, her breath frosting in the air, waiting. He removed his hat, revealing a head of thick, dark hair and a face carved by sun and wind. He wasn't a young man, perhaps 10 years her senior, with lines etched around his eyes that spoke of both laughter and loss. He held the hat in both hands, turning the brim over and over. "Ma'am," he began, his voice a low baritone, calm and even. "I owe you an apology. I've been writing this line for a week. I saw the clearing, but I thought the claim was abandoned." His gaze wasn't on her belly, for which she was grateful. It drifted over the half-built structure, taking in the details with a practiced eye. She saw his attention pause on the row of wooden pegs she had painstakingly carved and driven to secure the lower logs. They were straight, uniform, seated deep and true. It was a small thing, but it was honest work. "It isn't abandoned," Marin said. Her voice was a surprise, even to her, a rough, gravelly thing, shredded by the cold air and too many sleepless nights spent listening to the coyotes and the whisper of her own fears. This is my land, filed and proper. Your way is back north. She did not want a conversation. She did not want a neighbor. She wanted only the shield of her solitude, the fierce privacy of her struggle. The town of Bitter Juniper Creek had already given her its verdict with its sidelong glances and hushed whispers in the general store. A woman alone, and in her condition, was a scandal or a tragedy. And they hadn't yet decided which. She had no interest in their pity or their judgment. And she expected this man, this rancher, to be no different. Judah Renshaw did not argue the point. He didn't challenge her claim or question her right to be there. He simply gave a slow, deliberate nod, his eyes returning to her face. They were dark, steady eyes, and in their depths, she saw not pity, but something else, something that felt dangerously close to understanding. "I see that now," he said quietly. He gestured with his hat toward the wall she'd been working on. "It's not my place to argue with a woman who can drive a peg that straight in a coming snowstorm. A man learns to respect that kind of handiwork." The words disarmed her. She had been braced for a dispute, for condescension, for an offer of help that would feel like a judgment of her weakness. But this was different. It was an acknowledgement, a statement of fact from one builder to another. He wasn't seeing a pregnant woman playing at building a home. He was seeing the work itself. He placed his hat back on his head, settling it with a slight tug. "The name's Judah Renshaw. Double bar R is up on the ridge. If the storm turns foul, if you need anything." He let the offer hang in the air, unfinished, allowing her the dignity of choosing whether to accept or ignore it. "I'm fine," she clipped, the words sharper than she intended. He nodded again, accepting her answer without offense. "All right then." He turned back to his horse, swinging himself into the saddle. He gathered the reins, but paused for a moment, looking back at her one last time. "Winter comes on fast in these parts. Ma'am, don't let pride be the thing that leaves you cold." With that, he turned the roan and guided it back toward the trees, the horse's powerful legs churning through the deepening snow. He didn't look back again. Marin stood motionless, watching until the dark shapes of horse and rider were swallowed by the forest, leaving behind only a trail of dark, hoof-shaped wounds in the blanket of white. The silence that descended was heavier than before, filled with the echo of his voice and the unsettling warmth of his unexpected respect. She finally let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding, her shoulders slumping, leaning her full weight against the rough-hewn logs of the wall. She pressed a hand to her aching back and the other to her stomach, where a flutter of movement reminded her of the urgent, unyielding deadline she was racing against. Her heart, which had been a tight, cold knot of defiance in her chest, seemed to loosen, a painful, unfamiliar thawing beginning around its edges. He had seen her, not the scandal, not the pity case, but the work. The work was honest, and he had seen that. It was a terrifying and exhilarating thought. As the last light of the afternoon began to fail, painting the snow in shades of lavender and gray, her gaze drifted over her small, defiant world. The tools lay where she had left them, each a character in her solitary drama. The wood plane, its iron blade gleaming with a thin coat of oil, rested on a newly smoothed plank. The claw hammer, its wooden handle worn smooth and dark with the sweat and oil of her hand, lay beside a small scatter of iron nails she'd bought at the mercantile, a costly extravagance compared to the wooden pegs she fashioned herself. A few of the nails were half driven into a header beam, their heads glinting in the dying light. Paused mid-task, just as she was. Each tool, each half-finished detail, was a sentence in the story she was writing for herself, a story of sheer, unyielding will. She had come to Coldwater Bluff to disappear, to erase a past that had tried to break her. She had thought of it as an ending. But as she stood there, feeling the cold seep into her bones and the faint, unfamiliar warmth of a stranger's respect lingering in the air, another thought took root, clear and strong. "This is a beginning," she whispered to the child beneath her heart, the words a puff of white in the frozen air. "Not an end." The wind picked up, moaning through the gaps in the walls. A lonely, mournful sound. It was a reminder that her past was a shadow that still clung to her heels. And that winter, the great white wolf of the north, was no longer coming. It was here, and it was opening its jaws. The seeds of conflict had been sown, not just in the hushed gossip of the town, but in the quiet encounter at the edge of the woods, a conflict between a woman's desperate need for solitude and a man's quiet refusal to let her face the storm completely alone. A week passed. The snow held off, but the cold remained, a stubborn guest that refused to leave. The air grew thinner, sharper, and the sun was a pale, indifferent disk that slid across the southern sky, offering little light and no warmth. Maren had managed to get 3 of the 4 walls to their full height. Now she was staring at the problem of the roof. It would require beams, long and heavy, and a pitch she wasn't sure she could engineer alone, not with the cumbersome weight of the child shifting her balance. She was trying to strip bark from a long, straight pine with a draw knife, her body awkward, her belly a constant obstacle, when the sound of a horse's careful steps broke the silence. It was him, Judah Renshaw. He sat his roan in the same spot at the edge of the clearing, just as he had before. But this time, he wasn't empty-handed. He dismounted, and she saw he carried a bundle wrapped in brown paper and tied with twine, and a small canvas sack that smelled, even from a distance, of dried herbs. Maren dropped the draw knife. Her hand went to the small of her back, pressing against the ache, a gesture that was half rest, half defense. She would not be a project. She would not be the valley's charity case. He walked toward her, stopping a respectful distance away, well clear of her half-built home. He didn't smile. His face was as serious and steady as the landscape. "Ma'am," he said, his voice that same low rumble. He held out the packages. Maren's eyes narrowed. "I don't need supplies, Mr. Renshaw." "I know what you need," he said, his words devoid of condescension. It was a statement of fact. "This isn't supplies, it's a neighborly gesture." From the canvas sack, he pulled a sheaf of dried plants. "Ginger mint tea. My mother swears by it, says it settles the stomach and warms the blood." He gestured to the paper bundle. "And these? She had them put by. They're small. Wool, pale yellow." His directness about the items things clearly meant for a baby felt like a slap. A line had been crossed. "I didn't ask," Maren said, her voice dropping to a low, fierce growl. "I am not asking. I won't be pitied." She put every ounce of her remaining pride into those words, drawing a hard, clear line in the snow between them. The distinction was vital. Help was a transaction. Pity was a weapon. And she had been on the receiving end of it for too long. Judah's steady gaze did not waver. He looked at her, his eyes taking in the raw knuckles of her hands, the defiant set of her jaw, the exhaustion she couldn't hide. He didn't look shamed or angered by her rejection. He simply held his ground. "You should look closer, Mrs. O'Hara," he said, his voice quiet but carrying in the cold air. "Pity is for the weak. I don't see weakness here." He took a step closer. Not to her, but to a large, snow-dusted stump that marked the corner of her claim. "My mother isn't pitying you, and I'm not helping you because you're weak." He set the packages carefully on the flat surface of the stump. "I'm here," he said, turning back to face her fully. "Because you are so respectably strong, it makes a man feel ashamed for sitting by a warm fire while you're out here splitting logs. There's a difference." Maren had no answer for that. It struck the very core of her, silencing the sharp retort that had been waiting on her tongue. He had, once again, refused to see her as a victim. He saw her as a worker. He tipped his hat, a gesture of finality. "The tea is good, the sweater's well. Yellow is a warm color, that's all." He turned and walked back to the roan, mounted, and was gone, disappearing into the pines just as he had before. He did not wait for a thank you. He did not wait to be chased off. He respected her choice, even if that choice was to refuse him. Marin stood alone in the clearing. The silence was absolute. She stared at the packages on the stump, the brown paper, the twine. A small wisp of pale yellow wool poked from a tear in the paper. It was the color of spring daffodils, of baby chicks, of sunlight in a warm room. It was a color that had no place in this harsh, gray world. She didn't move for a long time. The wind picked up, brushing a dusting of snow off the packages. The scent of the ginger mint reached her, sharp and clean. It smelled like comfort. It smelled like a home that wasn't hers. Finally, with a heavy, reluctant sigh, she walked to the stump. Her blistered fingers fumbled with the twine. She brought the bundle inside her small, three-walled shelter, setting it by her meager pile of blankets. She wouldn't look at it, not yet, but the scent of the mint filled the cold air, and the ice that had encased her heart for months felt a small, painful fissure run through it. 2 days later, he returned. Marin was on her knees, trying to level a patch of frozen earth inside the cabin walls for the floor planking, her breath coming in short, sharp gasps. The work was too low, her belly too full. She heard the now familiar hoofbeats and steeled herself. When she looked up, he was already dismounted, a long two-man saw resting on his shoulder. He didn't speak. He didn't offer pleasantries. He walked past her to the pile of logs she had yet to cut to length for the roof beams. He sized them up, set the saw, and began to work. The sound was a rhythmic, rasping shh that cut through the afternoon. It was the sound of progress. It was the sound of work being done. Marin watched him for a full minute, her chest tight. He wasn't asking permission. He was simply doing what was needed, slowly, painfully. She pushed herself to her feet. She picked up her hammer and a handful of pegs and went back to work on the western wall, securing a log he had cut the day before. The silence between them stretched, filled only by the sounds of their labor. His saw, her hammer, shh, thud, thud, thud. It became a rhythm, a strange, unspoken partnership. He worked for 2 hours, cutting 4 perfect beams, notching them at the ends with an axe, his movements economical and precise. Then, as the light began to thin, he shouldered his saw, nodded once at her, and left. He came back the next day, and the day after. They worked in this shared silence, a space of inches and feet separating them, but their purpose aligned. They were building a house. The roof beams were the true test. Marin stood at one end of the first heavy beam, her hands raw, her shoulders burning. She looked at its length, at the height of the wall, and felt a flicker of true despair. She couldn't do it. It was too heavy. She braced herself, planting her feet wide, and took a deep breath, preparing to heave the log up with a desperate, lunging motion that she knew would wrench her back. Wait! His voice was right behind her. She hadn't even heard him approach. You lift like that, you'll put yourself on the ground for a week. And the baby, she bristled. I don't have a choice. Yes, you do. He walked to the other end of the beam. You're strong, but you're not a draft horse. Take your end. On 3, but don't heave, just lift. Use your legs. Ready. She nodded, her jaw tight. 1, 2, 3. She bent her knees and lifted, expecting the familiar, agonizing strain. But the weight wasn't what she expected. It was still heavy, a dead, massive weight. But his end rose in perfect time with hers. He was taking the majority of it. She realized, but doing it so subtly that it felt like she was still doing her half. He wasn't robbing her of the work. Walk it to the wall, he commanded, his voice strained. They moved in a slow, awkward shuffle, their boots crunching in the snow. They rested the beam against the wall frame. Now, he said, breathing hard. We have to get it up. I'll take the high end. You just push. Keep it steady. He positioned himself, his powerful shoulders bunching under his coat. With a grunt, he heaved the beam upward, sliding it up the wall pegs as Marin pushed from below, her own muscles screaming. It settled into the notches at the top with a solid, satisfying thunk. They stood back, breathing heavily in the cold. The first rafter was in place. It was the spine of the roof. He wiped his forehead with his sleeve and looked at her. For the first time, a small, tired smile touched the corners of his mouth. "See not a draft horse?" They broke for a moment. Sitting on separate stumps, Marin had boiled water on her small fire, and she poured some into 2 tin cups. She hesitated, then sprinkled a few of the dried ginger mint leaves into both. She handed one to him. He took it, their fingers brushing. His hands were like hers, scarred, calloused, ingrained with dirt and tar. "Thank you," he said, breathing in the steam. They drank in silence for a moment. "You lost your wife," Marin said. It wasn't a question. It was a statement. She'd seen the way he looked at the horizon sometimes, a hollowness that only came from one thing. Judah's gaze drifted to the cup in his hands. He nodded slowly. "Sarah, 2 years ago, this past spring." He took a sip of the tea. "She was a fine rider, better than me, but her gray mare spooked at a rattler on the high trail. Threw her before I could even shout." He went quiet, his thumb tracing the rim of the cup. "The Double Bar R is a big, empty house. My mother stays, but it's not the same. It's just a place to sleep." He had offered a piece of his truth, a small, hard, painful stone. Marin knew she had to offer one in return. "I left Boston," she said, her voice quiet. "I was married to a man who liked the city. He liked fine things. He didn't like complications." She touched her belly. "I left on a train in the middle of the night. Didn't tell anyone where I was going. I just ran." He didn't ask what the complication was. He didn't ask the man's name. He just nodded, accepting her stone and placing it next to his. "Boston's a long way from here," he said. "It's not far enough," she whispered. The air between them had changed. It was no longer the silence of strangers, but the quiet of 2 people who had seen each other's scars. The next week, Marin had to go to Bitter Juniper Creek. She was out of flour and salt, and the baby would be coming. She needed cloth. She dreaded it. The town was a gauntlet of judging eyes. She walked into the general store, her head held high, the small bell over the door announcing her arrival with a cheerful, mocking jingle. The store went quiet. Mrs. Pendergast, who was measuring out beans for another customer, froze, her hand hovering over the scale. 2 women by the bulk goods counter stopped their chatter and turned as one, their eyes dropping immediately to Marin's belly, then rising to her face with a cold, flat curiosity. Marin ignored them, walking to the counter. "Mrs. Pendergast, I need 10 pounds of flour, 2 of salt, and 20 yards of the flannel, if you have it." Mrs. Pendergast moved with deliberate slowness. "Flannel, is it?" she said, her voice thin. "We have a nice blue, or a pink." "White," Marin said firmly. As Mrs. Pendergast measured the flour, the whispers started, just loud enough for Marin to hear. "All alone up on the bluff. And him, Judah Renshaw, riding up there every day, I tell you. A disgrace. His poor dead wife hardly cold. With Lillian Ainsworth waiting right here in town for him. Her father won't stand for it. Some Boston woman, no husband to speak of." Marin felt her face flush, a hot, creeping shame. She set her coins on the counter, her hand trembling slightly. Through the store's grimy front window, she could see Judah across the street, talking to the blacksmith. He wasn't with her, but in their eyes, she was tainting him. She was a sickness he had caught. She gathered her purchases, her back rigid. As she turned to leave, one of the women, bolder than the rest, said clearly, "Some people have no shame." Marin stopped at the door. She turned, her blue eyes as cold as the wind. "Shame," she said, her voice clear and carrying. is a luxury I can't afford. Madam, I'm too busy building my house." She walked out, her head high, leaving a stunned, angry silence behind her. She was back at the cabin, unloading her things, her heart pounding with a cold, sharp anger. When Judah rode up, he was earlier than usual. He dismounted and looked at her, his expression unreadable. "I was in town," he said. "I know. I saw you," she snapped, yanking the sack of flour from her sled. "I heard the talk, Marin." He used her first name. It hung in the air, a new and startling thing. "Then you should stay away," she said, her voice thick. "I don't need your help, and I don't need you tainting your good name on my account. Go back to your ranch. Go back to Miss Lillian Ainsworth, whoever she is." He stood there, just watching her fight with the heavy sack. Finally, he stepped forward and took it from her, his strength effortless. He carried it inside and set it down gently. He came back out and stood in front of her. "I've been letting talk run my life for 2 years. Marin, listening to what my father thinks is proper grief, listening to what the town thinks is a suitable match. I'm done letting whispers decide where I ride." He looked at the half-finished roof. "We have 2 hours of light. Let's not waste it on them." He picked up his hammer, climbed the ladder to the roof, and began to work. Marin watched him for a beat, the anger and shame warring with a different, warmer emotion. He wasn't defending her. He wasn't denying the talk. He was simply ignoring it. He was choosing the work. She took a breath, grabbed her own hammer, and climbed up after him. They worked side by side, the rhythm of their 2 hammers becoming one, a steady, defiant beat against the encroaching cold and the silent judgment of the valley. She paused to rest her hand, looking at him as he set a shingle, his focus absolute. He wasn't a hero. He wasn't a savior. He was just a man with his own ghosts, building a roof. She admitted it then, in the quiet of her own mind. The words a silent concession. He's not fixing me. He's just standing by while I fix myself. And for the first time since she'd left Boston, she didn't feel entirely alone. Whispers travel faster than a blizzard in this valley, and they carry a chill that has nothing to do with the weather. The story of Judah Renshaw, widower and heir to the largest ranch in the territory, spending his days at the half-built cabin of a lone, pregnant woman, was a fire that needed no kindling. It swept through bitter Juniper Creek, warming the pious in their pews and giving the gossips at the mercantile a reason to lower their voices and lean closer together. It was a scandal made perfect by its ingredients: a respected family name, a fallen woman, and the specter of a broken engagement to one of the town's own. The physical embodiment of that engagement arrived on a Tuesday, when the sky was the color of a lead slug and threatened more snow. Marin was fitting a window frame, her movements slow and measured, when she heard the sound, not the familiar, rhythmic tread of Judah's roan, but the crisp crunch of fine carriage wheels on the packed snow and the jingle of a superior harness. A black carriage, so polished it reflected the grim sky, was pulled to a halt at the edge of her clearing by a matched pair of black geldings. It was a vehicle of stark, urban elegance, an inkblot on the white page of the wilderness. A driver in a heavy wool coat sat stiffly on the box, his gaze fixed straight ahead, pretending the rough cabin before him did not exist. The door opened, and a woman emerged. She was the town-made flesh. Lillian Ainsworth was tall and slender, wrapped in a dark green woolen coat trimmed with black fur at the collar and cuffs. Her face, framed by a fashionable hat, was beautiful in a way that seemed both delicate and unbreakable, like fine porcelain. She pulled on a pair of soft, kid-leather gloves, smoothing the fingers with a practiced, deliberate motion that conveyed an infinite, unhurried patience. She was not a woman accustomed to being kept waiting. She navigated the uneven ground with a graceful disdain, her fine boots barely sinking into the snow. She stopped several feet from Marin, her posture perfect, her hands clasped loosely at her waist. "Mrs. O'Hara," Lillian's voice was exactly as Marin had imagined, cultured, clear, and coated with a thin, polite veneer of ice. Marin did not put down her hammer. She merely turned to face the woman, her own attire a worn man's coat over a patched dress, her hair escaping its bun in wisps, a stark and defiant contrast. "I'm Marin O'Hara," she corrected, omitting the honorific. It didn't belong to her. Lillian gave a small, tight smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Of course. Forgive me. I am Lillian Ainsworth." She let her name hang in the air, weighted with the significance of her father's bank and her family's standing. "I've come for a civilized conversation." "There's nothing to converse about," Marin said, her voice flat. "I disagree," Lillian replied smoothly, her gaze sweeping over the unfinished cabin, the pile of wood shavings, the general, desperate state of Marin's enterprise. It was not a look of pity, but of cold assessment, as if she were inspecting a piece of faulty merchandise. This situation, it has become untenable, for everyone. My situation is my own. "Is it?" Lillian took a half-step closer, her voice dropping to a more confidential, more dangerous tone. "When your situation involves the Renshaw name, it becomes the town's business. It becomes my business." Marin felt the anger, hot and familiar, rise in her chest, but she held it down. She would not give this woman the satisfaction of a scene. "Mr. Renshaw comes here of his own accord. I've sent him away more than once." "And yet he returns," Lillian stated. "Men like Judah, they are driven by a sense of duty, of misplaced chivalry. They see a damsel in distress and they cannot help themselves. But it is the damsel's responsibility to know when the rescue is causing more harm than good." The insult was perfectly delivered, wrapped in the guise of worldly wisdom. Marin's grip tightened on the hammer. "I am not a damsel, and I am not in distress." "Aren't you?" Lillian's eyes finally, deliberately, dropped to Marin's swollen belly. "A woman alone, with winter coming on, with a child of no name. If that is not distress, I shudder to think what is." Marin held her ground. "I asked for none of this. I didn't ask him to come near me. I just don't turn away a decent man." The admission of Judah's decency seemed to annoy Lillian. Her polite mask slipped for a fraction of a second. His decency is being twisted into a public spectacle. The name of the Double Bar R, a name that has meant honor and stability in this valley for 40 years, is being dragged through the mud, my name along with it. She straightened, her spine like a steel rod. "I am here to propose a solution, a way for you to leave this place with some dignity, and for the rest of us to resume our lives. My father is prepared to be generous. Enough money for a train ticket, east or west. Your choice. Enough to see you settled somewhere new, somewhere no one knows your story." It was a bribe dressed as a rescue. Marin felt a bitter laugh rise in her throat. "My dignity isn't for sale, Miss Ainsworth." Lillian's patience finally frayed. The pretense of a civilized conversation was over. "Then perhaps you should consider the consequences of your pride," she said, her voice turning sharp and cold. "The Ainsworth Bank holds the note on the spring cattle contracts for half the ranches in this territory. A word from my father, a suggestion that the Renshaw name is becoming unreliable, and those contracts could dry up like a creek in August. The church deacons listen to my mother. The women's auxiliary listens to me. A family's reputation is built over decades. It can be dismantled in a single season of gossip." She paused, taking a deliberate step back as if to punctuate her final, devastating point. She lifted her chin, a small, regal gesture, and the wind seemed to obey, gusting hard and driving a fresh flurry of snow from the gray sky. "You are one woman, building one small, cold house. You are setting yourself against the foundations of this entire community. It is not a battle you can win." With that, she turned, her coat swirling around her, and walked back to the carriage without a backward glance. The driver opened the door. She disappeared inside, and the carriage pulled away. leaving behind only crisp, clean tracks in the new snow, and a silence that felt colder and more profound than before. Judah learned of the visit that evening, not from Marin he hadn't ridden out that afternoon, but from one of his ranch hands, a young man named Silas who had been in town and heard the story, already embellished, from the blacksmith's wife. The dinner table at the Double Bar R was a place of unspoken rules and ironclad tradition. At its head sat Elias Renshaw, Judah's father. He was a man who seemed carved from the same hard, unforgiving granite as the surrounding mountains. He had built the ranch from nothing, and he ruled it, and his family, with a will that never bent. The meal was eaten in near silence, the only sounds the clink of heavy silverware on china and the hiss of the fire in the great stone hearth. Judah's mother, a woman long faded into the background of her husband's powerful presence, ate with her eyes on her plate. Finally, Elias Renshaw set down his knife and fork, the sound unnaturally loud. He fixed his pale, piercing eyes on his son. "I had a talk with Henry Ainsworth today," he said. His voice was flat, without inflection, which made it all the more menacing. "About cattle futures." Judah met his father's gaze, and he expressed concern about stability, about a man's focus being where it ought to be. Elias picked up his water glass. "He seemed to think your focus was up on Coldwater Bluff." Judah said nothing. He had known this was coming. "This family, this land," his father continued, his voice a low grind, "was built on a name, on honor, on knowing our obligations. The Ainsworths are our partners. Lillian is your obligation. You gave your word." "A word given for me," Judah said quietly. "A word is a word." Elias's voice cracked like a whip, and his wife flinched. "It holds. It is the foundation. You will end this foolishness. You will ride into town tomorrow. You will apologize to Lillian, and you will not go back to that bluff. That woman is not your concern. The Renshaw name is your concern." Judah pushed his chair back slowly. The silent conflict that had been simmering between them for 2 years, since Sarah's death, had finally come to a boil. It was about Marin. Yes, but it was about more. It was about land and legacy, and a son's life being plotted out like a parcel of pasture. "I will think on it," Judah said, his voice dangerously calm. He stood, folded his napkin, and left the room, the sound of his boots echoing on the polished floorboards. He left his father sitting like a block of granite at the head of the table, his face a mask of cold, unyielding fury. Marin did not sleep that night. Lillian's words, Lillian's threats, echoed in her mind. For the first time, her iron resolve began to waver. This was no longer just her fight. She had thought only of herself and the child, of carving out a place where they could be safe from the judgments of the world. But she had inadvertently dragged Judah into her storm. She was threatening his legacy, his family, the very ground beneath his feet. She thought of the child sleeping in her womb, a child who would be born into this fight, marked by this scandal before it even drew its first breath. Was her pride worth his ruin? The wind howled, finding its way through every chink and gap in the unfinished roof. It no longer sounded like a lonely, natural thing. It sounded like voices, like the whispers from the general store, magnified into a chorus of accusation. She tempted him. She trapped him. A disgrace. Ruin. Judah did not come the next day, or the day after. His absence was a louder statement than any argument. He had chosen, she thought, and he had chosen his family, his name. He had chosen silence, and that silence felt heavier in her heart than the weight of any hammer, any roof beam. It was the weight of a hope she hadn't even known she was carrying. On the third morning, she found a small, broken piece of a hand mirror she had carried with her from Boston, one of the few vanities she had allowed herself. The glass was fractured, a web of fine cracks running across its surface. She held it up. In it, she saw her own face, pale and strained, her eyes shadowed with sleeplessness. Her reflection was broken, split into a dozen different versions of herself, and through the cracks in the silvered glass, she could see the reflection of the world outside the relentless, unforgiving white of the snow, piling deeper and deeper against her walls. The image was a perfect, terrible metaphor. A broken woman, a broken life, superimposed on a landscape that promised to bury her. A choice had to be made. A painful, terrible choice. And she knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the soul, that it would mean tearing down the one small thing she had managed to build. The 3 days of Judah's absence were a silence that deafened. Maren told herself it was a relief. The town had won. Lillian Ainsworth had won. The proper order of things, of names and land and money, had been restored. He had gone back to his world, and she was left in hers. A world she had built with her own 2 hands, and a world that was now, finally, roofed. But the silence felt like a judgment. It felt like an ending. She worked with a feverish, desperate energy, chinking the gaps between the logs with a mixture of mud and dried grass, fighting the wind that stole the warmth from her fingers. She was alone again, truly alone, and the weight of it was a physical ache that surpassed the fire in her lower back. She had made her decision. Lillian was right. She could not win this fight, and it was not hers to wage. She would finish the chinking, make the cabin survivable, and as soon as the baby was born and she was strong enough to travel, she would leave. She would sell the claim for whatever she could get and move on, further west, where the mountains were even bigger and the names even smaller. On the afternoon of the 4th day, the sky, which had been a flat, iron gray, turned a bruised, sickly yellow. The wind, which had been a constant moan, fell silent. A profound, unnatural hush fell over Coldwater Bluff. It was the deep breath the wilderness takes before it strikes. Then the storm hit. It did not begin with a few flakes. It was as if the sky simply tore open. A solid, blinding wall of white obliterated the world. The wind returned, not as a moan, but as a high-pitched shriek, a banshee's wail that clawed at the new roof. It was the first true blizzard of the season, a white darkness that erased the trees, the ground, the very air. Maren huddled inside, the small iron stove in the corner roaring, consuming her precious wood at an alarming rate. The wind forced its way through the new, unseasoned chinking, spraying fine, dry snow into the single room. She stuffed rags into the worst of the gaps, her heart a cold stone in her chest. She was trapped. All her plans to leave, all her resolve, meant nothing against this. The storm raged through the night and into the next day. The world was reduced to the 4 walls of her cabin and the scream of the wind. It was late afternoon, the light already fading from the small, snow-caked windows, when she heard it. It was not a call. It was not the sound of a horse. It was a heavy, desperate thudding against the new door she had set, a sound half lost in the howl of the wind. She froze. No one could be out in this, a bear, perhaps, or a panther, driven mad by the storm. Thud! Thud! It was a fist. She grabbed the rifle, her hands shaking so badly she could barely work the lever. She moved to the door, her belly pressing against the wood. "Who's there?" she shouted, her voice thin against the gale. A voice answered, thick and torn by the wind. "Maren, let me in. It's Judah." Her heart stopped. She fumbled with the wooden latch, her frozen fingers clumsy, and pulled the heavy door inward. A wall of snow and a figure encased in it fell inside, collapsing to the floor in a heap of ice and frozen wool. It was Judah, but not the man she knew. He was barely recognizable. His hat was gone. His hair and beard were a solid mask of ice. His heavy coat was frozen stiff, and a dark, ominous patch stained his left sleeve. He was shaking, not with a simple chill, a trembling so violent it seemed to come from his very bones. "My God," she whispered. She dropped the rifle and slammed the door shut against the white fury, latching it. "Had to walk," he breathed, his teeth chattering so hard he could barely form the words. "Horse went down, in the drift, by the creek. You're freezing to death. She grabbed his arm, pulling him. He was a dead weight. Get to the fire, now! She half dragged, half shoved him across the floor to the small hearth. Where the stove radiated a circle of blessed heat, he fell onto the braided rag rug she had laid, his body curling instinctively toward the warmth. Your coat, she commanded. Get it off. His fingers were useless, like frozen claws. Marin knelt before him, her own body clumsy with the baby, and fought with the ice-caked buttons and stiff leather. It was like trying to peel the bark from a frozen log. She finally ripped it open, pulling it off his shoulders. The dark patch on his sleeve was not just melted snow. You're hurt. Shoulder, he managed, wincing as she pulled the fabric. Hit a rock. When the horse fell, I don't think it's broken, just cold. She got the coat off, then his vest. His shirt beneath was soaked. The shirt, too, all of it. You'll die in wet clothes. There was no modesty in this, only the brutal pragmatism of survival. He fumbled with the buttons, his hands shaking too much. She brushed them aside and undid them herself, her gaze fixed on the task, ignoring the hard muscle of his chest, the scars from old ranch work. She grabbed her driest, thickest blanket and threw it around his shoulders, then shoved his cup of half-drunk cold tea from the morning into his hands. Drink. He drank, spilling most of it. She went to the stove, threw in more wood, and put the kettle on to boil for fresh tea. For 10 minutes, the only sounds were the roar of the stove, the scream of the wind, and the violent, uncontrollable rattling of Judah's teeth. He sat hunched in the blanket, his back to the room, staring directly into the stove's small, glowing grate. The firelight flickered across his face, illuminating the ice melting in his hair and the exhausted, stark lines around his eyes. He looked like a man who had walked through the end of the world. Slowly, the worst of the shaking subsided. He took the fresh, steaming cup of ginger mint tea she offered, wrapping his raw, red hands around it. You're a fool, Judah Renshaw, she said, her voice rough with a fear she wouldn't name. You're a damn fool for being out in this. He took a long, shuddering sip. Had to come? He said, his voice still thick. I couldn't let you think what Lillian said was the end of it. Marin stilled. What? I've been at my father's, he said. He was still looking at the fire, not at her. We had it out, the last 3 days. He described it in short, clipped sentences, the shouting, the accusations, the granite will of his father meeting his own, the ultimatum, the land or the woman, the name or the scandal. You cannot have both. I told him, Judah said, his voice growing steadier as the warmth returned, that the land and the name were his to keep. He built them, but my life is my own. I wouldn't be his brand on a cow. He told me if I rode to this bluff, I was no longer his son. Marin sank onto the small stool opposite him, her hands covering her mouth. And Lillian? She whispered. I went to her house. Yesterday, before the storm hit. He took another sip. I told her the truth, that the engagement was a mistake, a business arrangement my father made, and one I couldn't honor. Not anymore. He finally turned to look at her, his dark eyes catching the firelight. I am disowned. Marin, I have my horse when I find him my saddle, and the clothes on my back. The Double Bar R is no longer my home. He had sacrificed everything, his birthright, his family, his future. For her, for a woman who was a stranger, a scandal, a lie. The weight of his sacrifice crushed her. The shame she had felt in the general store, the shame Lillian had thrown at her, was nothing compared to this. He had given up his world for a woman who wasn't even free to accept him. Judah, she said, her voice a low, strangled thing. She had to tell him. She had to give him the truth, a truth far colder than the storm outside. He had built his stand on quicksand. Judah, you've made a terrible mistake. He watched her. his expression unreadable. She stood up, pacing the small space, her hands twisting in the folds of her dress. She stopped, her back to him, facing the rough wall she had built. "You've given up everything for me, and I'm not who you think I am." She turned. The firelight cast deep shadows on her face, making her eyes look like dark, haunted hollows. "My name, O'Hara, it's mine, but it's not the only one. Judah, I am still married." The confession hung in the small cabin, a sound louder than the howling wind. Judah did not move. He did not blink. His breathing, which had been ragged, seemed to steady, to deepen, like the rhythmic tread of a horse on a long journey. Marin's words came tumbling out, a torrent of shame held back for too long. "His name is Percival Dane. Percival. Even his name sounds like money, doesn't it? He's a Boston man. Imports, shipping. He was charming. He saw me at a dance. He said I was unpolished, real different from the Boston girls." She laughed, a short, bitter sound. "I was a fool. I believed him. We were married for 6 months. 6 months of dinners and parties and him showing me off. And then I told him about the baby. Told him." She stopped, pressing a hand to her stomach. He changed. It was like a switch had been thrown. He became cold, polite. He said it was an inconvenience, that it would complicate his arrangements. He didn't want a child. He accused me, said it couldn't be his. And then, one day he was gone, left a note, said he had business in Philadelphia and he just didn't come back. She was shaking now, but with memory, not cold. "I was ruined, a wife, but abandoned, pregnant. A scandal in Boston is a quiet, polite thing. Judah, they just stop seeing you. The invitations stop, the doors close. I had no money of my own. I sold my mother's pearls, the last thing I had of her. And I bought a train ticket west. I didn't file for divorce. I didn't know how. I was afraid of the shame, of the lawyers, afraid he'd come back and take the baby. So I ran. I buried it. I came here to build a life where no one knew, where that piece of paper in Boston couldn't touch me." She finished, her breath catching in a half-sob. "So you see," she whispered, tears finally tracing paths through the wood smoke on her cheeks. "You've given up your home for a woman who belongs to another man. A liar. A coward." The silence stretched. Judah just sat, the firelight playing on his face. He set his cup down on the floor with a steady hand. He looked at her, at the raw-knuckled hands she had clenched into fists, at the belly that held the child of a man named Percival Dane, at the fierce, broken pride in her eyes. He stood up, still wrapped in the blanket, and walked the 2 steps that separated them. He didn't reach for her body. He reached for her hands. He slowly, gently, uncurled her fists, his own large, calloused hands enveloping hers. They were warm now, from the fire. Hers were freezing. "Marin," he said, his voice low and firm, the baritone that had first registered as respect, not pity. "Your truth is a heavy load. It's the heaviest I've ever heard." He held her hands tighter. "It's too heavy to carry alone, so let me help you carry it." She let out a sound, a small choked gasp that was part sob, part disbelief. It wasn't the sound of weakness. It was the sound of a support beam, strained to the point of breaking, finally finding a post to rest on. It was the sound of the first genuine relief she had felt in a year. He knew the worst of her, the legal, shameful, terrible truth, and he had not let go of her hands. "Out here," he continued, his gaze holding hers. "A man's honor, a person's honor, isn't a piece of paper in a Boston courthouse. It's not a calling card. It's the wood you chop. It's the roof you raise against a storm. It's the truth you tell when it's hard. By that measure, there isn't a more honorable woman in this territory." She shook her head, tears flowing freely. "But the law, Judah, I am his wife." "The law," he said, his voice hardening, "is a piece of paper. We can change a piece of paper. We can fight that. He released one of her hands and gently, with a rough finger, wiped a tear from her cheek. This changes one thing, only one. The law has to be clean. We can't cross that line, not until you are free. But I'm not leaving. I am disowned. Marin, I have nowhere else to go. But even if I did, I wouldn't. I'm standing with you. Our alliance it's just what it was. We're partners. She looked at him, really looked at him, and saw a man as strong and steady as the mountains. His own heart set on a new, unyielding line. A new energy settled her. The shaking stopped. The fear was replaced by a cold, hard resolve. Not Boston, she said, her voice clear. I won't fight him in Boston. That's his ground. He'd bury me. No, Judah agreed. This is Montana territory. Our laws are simpler, more practical. There's a lawyer in Helena, man named Eliab Fitch. He understands abandonment. He understands frontier justice. We don't need Boston. We need Helena. She nodded, pulling her hands free, her purpose restored. She went to her small crate of possessions, the few things she'd carried from her old life. She pulled out a small, leather-bound folder containing a few sheets of paper, a pen, and a small, dried-up ink well. She added water from the kettle, shaking it to make a thin, gray ink. She sat at the rough-hewn table she had built, pulling the stool close. Judah lit the oil lamp, adding its small, steady glow to the firelight. He stood behind her, a silent guard, while she began to write. She did not write a long, pleading letter. She wrote a statement. She stated her name, her married name, and the fact of her abandonment. She stated the date her husband had left and the fact of her pregnancy. She requested, in the simplest, strongest terms, a dissolution of the marriage on the grounds of desertion, to be filed within the territory of Montana. She finished, signed her name Marin O'Hara, and folded the sheet. She slid it into an envelope. Judah, seeing what she needed, pulled a small block of beeswax from his pocket, part of a rancher's repair kit. He held it to the stove's grate until it softened, and she dripped a small pool of it onto the envelope's flap. She pressed it shut with her thumb. The letter sat on the table, a stark white rectangle in the flickering light. Outside, the storm shrieked, but inside, there was a profound quiet. The envelope was a legal document. It was a declaration of war. It was the first shot fired in a battle for her name. It was a door she had just sealed, and another she had just, finally, begun to open. The blizzard broke as suddenly as it had begun, leaving behind a world scoured clean and buried in a profound, white silence. The sky that emerged was a hard, brilliant blue, and the sun on the snow was so bright it hurt the eyes. For Judah and Marin, the storm had changed everything. The confession in the firelight had forged a new, more honest foundation between them. The howling wind had blown away the last of their pretense. Now, there was only the work. Their days fell into a rhythm dictated by the sun and the cold. They were a campaign against the coming winter, each task a small battle won. The roof was their primary objective. They worked together to build the central king post truss, a heavy, triangular frame that would bear the main load. Marin, despite her size, had a fine eye for angles. She marked the cuts with a piece of charcoal, while Judah, his shoulder now a dull, manageable ache, made them with a saw. Raising it was a feat of engineering and brute force. They used a simple lever and fulcrum, a long pine log propped on a stump, to hoist the heavy truss into place. Marin put her full weight on the end of the lever, her feet digging into the snow, her breath pluming in the air, while Judah, perched precariously on the top plate of the wall, guided it, his voice a series of low commands. Easy, easy now. The truss settled into its slot with a groan of wood on wood, and for a moment they just stood there, breathing hard, looking at the A-frame silhouetted against the bright sky. It was the skeleton of a real home. The rafters followed, one by one. They worked in a tandem of shared muscle and unspoken understanding. He would lift the heavy end, she the lighter, and they would walk it into place. Their hands were chapped and raw, their coats perpetually damp with sweat and melting snow that dripped from the pines. Often, a dusting of snow would fall from a high branch, settling on their hair and the backs of their necks, and they would brush it away without breaking the rhythm of the hammer. Once the roof was sheathed in rough planked pine, they turned their attention to the walls. The chinking was tedious, cold work. Maren mixed the clay soil with water and dried grass, her hands plunging into the icy mud until they were numb. Judah forced the mixture into the gaps between the logs, using a small, carved trowel, his movements methodical and sure. Their world shrank to the few feet of wall in front of them, their conversation reduced to simple, practical questions. More mud. Is that gap filled? Sweat froze on their brows. Snow clung to their eyelashes. They were partners in a desperate, elemental act of creation. While the cabin was their shared focus, their individual preparations continued in parallel. Judah, with a rancher's eye for the lay of the land, saw a potential disaster. The cabin sat in a slight hollow, and he knew the first major thaw would send a river of meltwater straight for the foundation. He spent 2 days with a shovel, his bad shoulder protesting, digging a shallow diversion trench along the high side of the clearing, a small, earthen dam to guide the water away. It was the kind of work Maren would never have thought of, a foresight born of a life spent reading the moods of the land. Maren, in turn, focused on the world that was coming to life inside the walls. In the evenings, by the light of the oil lamp, she sat by the stove and sewed. From the 20 yards of white flannel she had bought in town, she cut and hemmed a small mountain of diapers, her stitches small and even. Her needle rose and fell, a tiny, rhythmic counterpoint to the crackle of the fire. On a piece of spare paper, she made a calendar, marking the days, making small notes of the baby's movements, the Braxton Hicks contractions that were becoming more frequent. It was a logbook of her own body, a way of imposing order on the terrifying, beautiful unknown. As a final precaution, she found a small, tinny bell and tied it with a piece of leather to the inside of the door latch. In a blizzard, the wind could sound like anything. The bell would be a clear, sharp signal, an alarm against the storm. One afternoon, a different sound came from the edge of the woods. It was not a carriage or a lone rider, but a heavy, horse-drawn work sled, driven by a burly, bearded man in a sheepskin coat. With him were 2 small, bundled children and a woman with a round, kind face and a colorful scarf tied over her hair. They were the Kowalskis, a Polish family whose small homestead was a mile down the creek, people Maren had only ever seen from a distance. The man, whose name was Stefan, stopped the sled and got down, his English thick and heavily accented. "We see you build," he said, gesturing with a mittened hand toward the cabin. "Winter is hard. A sled is good to have. For wood, for need." He pointed to the sturdy sled tied to the back of his own. It was old, but well made. "You borrow. Until spring." Maren was speechless. It was an offer of pure, unadorned kindness, with no questions asked and no judgment offered. I have no money to pay you for it," she stammered. Stefan's wife, Maria, smiled, her cheeks red from the cold. "Not for money," she said. "For neighbor is law of this place." Maren went inside and came back with one of the few treasures she possessed, a small, sealed jar of wild strawberry preserves she had made in the late summer, hoarding it for the deepest part of winter. The glass shone like a ruby in the pale light. She held it out to Maria. "For your children," she said. Maria's eyes lit up. She took the jar as if it were a jewel. A trade had been made, not of currency, but of labor and forethought. A small bridge had been built across the snow. The story of the sled and the preserves made its way to bitter Juniper Creek. It changed the flavor of the gossip. The condemnation was still there, but it was now mixed with a new, grudging curiosity. She traded with the Kowalskis, made the jam herself, they say, and Renshaw, he dug a ditch around that cabin like he was fortifying a fort. The narrative was slowly shifting from one of shame to one of survival. A lone, pregnant woman was a scandal. A woman who built her own home, traded with her neighbors, and had the disowned heir of the double bar R for a partner that was something else entirely. It was a story. The old powers, however, did not deal in stories. They dealt in ledgers and law. One morning, a rider came from the double bar R. It wasn't Elias Renshaw, but his foreman, a hard-faced man named Calloway. He did not dismount. He handed a thick envelope down to Judah. "Mr. Renshaw, Sr." Calloway said, his tone formal and cold. "Requests you sign these papers and have them witnessed in town. They relinquish your claim to any and all inheritance." Judah took the envelope. He didn't open it. He simply looked up at the foreman. "You tell my father," he said, his voice quiet but carrying the cold authority of a man who had made his peace with loss, "that I have already relinquished my claim. I don't need a piece of paper to make it so. I won't be signing anything." Calloway stared for a long moment, then gave a curt nod, turned his horse, and rode away. The break was final. Judah watched him go, his face impassive. Then he turned and went back to splitting firewood. Lillian Ainsworth, for her part, played a longer, more subtle game. She was seen in church the following Sunday, looking radiant in a new blue coat. She smiled at everyone, inquired after their health, and spoke of the upcoming Christmas charity bake with serene composure. She betrayed no sign of a broken heart or a slighted pride. Her pain, if she felt it, was a private, well-guarded thing. By refusing to appear the victim, she kept the town's sympathy and held her position. She was a silent, graceful adversary, and in many ways, more dangerous for it. Marin felt the weight of all these currents, the whispers, the threats, the silent judgments. She practiced what she came to think of as standing still before the axe. She did not defend herself. She did not explain. When she had to go to town for supplies, she met the stares with a calm, level gaze and conducted her business with a quiet dignity. Her response was her work. Every neat stack of firewood, every well-chinked log, every straight seam on a tiny, flannelled diaper was her answer to their whispers. She would not argue with them. She would simply outbuild them. The nights were the hardest and the best. The tiny cabin, now sealed against the wind, grew warm and close from the stove. The scent of pine and wood smoke filled the air. After a long day of brutal physical labor, they would eat a simple meal of stew or beans in a shared, comfortable silence. They had established a boundary, a line that the law had drawn between them, but the intimacy of their shared struggle was a palpable thing. One night, the exhaustion of the day's work hit Judah harder than usual. He sat in the simple wooden chair he'd built, his plate empty, his head nodding. Marin watched him from her own stool as she cleaned their plates. His hand, resting on his knee, was smudged with soot and dirt, the knuckles raw. He had been digging out a stubborn, frozen root all afternoon. His head finally dropped to his chest, and a low, soft snore escaped him. Marin moved quietly. She took her heaviest wool blanket, the one she kept for the coldest nights, and gently, so as not to wake him, she draped it over his broad shoulders, tucking it around his neck. It was a simple, maternal gesture of care, an acknowledgement of the shelter he was providing for her, and the small shelter she could offer him in return. He stirred at the touch, his body tensing for a moment before relaxing into the warmth of the wool. His eyes fluttered open, heavy with sleep. Across the 2 feet of firelit air, their gazes met. Nothing was said. There was no need for words. The only sound was the sharp crackle of a log shifting in the stove, a sound like a heart turning over. In his eyes, she saw not just exhaustion, but a deep, quiet gratitude. In hers, he saw a vulnerability and a strength that stole his breath. It was a moment of pure, unguarded connection, more intimate than any touch. He closed his eyes again, settling deeper into the chair and the blanket. Maren went back to her sewing, but her fingers were clumsy now, her heart beating a little too fast. Later, she awoke to the sound of the door opening and closing softly. She sat up, her heart pounding. Judah was standing by the door, pulling on his boots. He had been outside. He turned, and in his hand was a small, flat piece of pine. He didn't say a word. He took 2 small nails from the box on the mantelpiece and picked up the hammer, quietly, without ceremony. He stood on a stool and nailed the piece of wood to the thick header beam that ran above the inside of the cabin door. He stepped down and looked at his work. Maren got out of her bed of pine boughs and blankets, her bare feet cold on the wood floor. She walked over and stood beside him, looking up. Carved into the wood in neat, simple letters were 2 words: O'Hara Cabin. He hadn't put his name. He hadn't claimed a share. He had, in this small, silent act, affirmed that this was her creation, her land, her victory. He was its protector, its co-builder, but he was not its owner. It was the deepest gesture of respect he could possibly have made. She reached out and traced the carved letters with her finger, the wood still cool from the night air. It was a house, and now it had a name, her name. The new storm did not arrive with the coy diplomacy of the last. This one was a declaration of war. It came from the high peaks of the north, a solid, screaming mass of white that struck Coldwater Bluff like a physical blow. The world did not go dark. It vanished. The trees, the creek, the sky, all were erased, consumed by a churning, vertical ocean of snow. The wind screamed, a high, thin note of absolute fury that seemed to be trying to peel the new roof from the logs. The cabin, which had felt so strong, so solid, now seemed like a tiny, fragile box. It groaned under the pressure, the newly set beams popping and creaking like the timbers of a ship caught in a typhoon. Maren felt the pressure change in her bones. She was stacking the last of the split firewood by the stove when the first pain hit. It was not the familiar ache in her back, nor the preparatory tightening she had been logging in her mind. This was different. This was a low, powerful clench that grabbed her spine and squeezed, stealing her breath. She braced herself against the wall, her eyes wide. It was too soon. By her own careful calculations, she had 3 weeks, perhaps 4. The storm roared, and as if in answer, another wave seized her. It was stronger this time, a deep, primal command. The baby was not waiting for a thaw. It was coming now. A cold, sharp fear, colder than the wind, pierced her resolve. Her careful plans, her stacks of flannel, the boiled water, they were all based on the idea that she would be in control. She looked at her hands. They were shaking. She had built a fortress, but the siege was coming from the inside. Miles away, on the far, northern edge of what had been his father's land, Judah Renshaw was in a small, dilapidated line shack. He'd ridden out 2 days before, driven by a restless energy. To check a series of traps and to mend a fence line he knew his father's men would ignore. He was a man without a home, and the vast, empty wilderness felt more honest to him than the silent, judging rooms of the double bar R. He had been watching the sky, noting the sickly yellow light, and was packing his saddlebags to ride back when the storm hit the ridge. It was faster and more violent than any he had ever seen. The wind struck the shack so hard the small structure shuddered, and snow began to force its way through the door jamb. He knew his roan would never make it in a whiteout. He was trapped, safe enough in the shack, but stranded. He had wood, he had food. He would wait it out. He sat by the small, rusted stove, feeding it sticks, and listened to the wind, and then, through the howl, he felt it. It was not a sound, it was a jolt, deep in his gut, a sharp, visceral pull, as if a rope he didn't know he was holding had been snapped taut. Marin? It was madness. She was fine. The cabin was strong. He had built the roof himself, but the feeling intensified. A cold dread that had nothing to do with the temperature. The wind howled, and it sounded, for a moment, like a woman's scream. He stood up. He was a practical man. He knew this was irrational. He knew riding into this was a death sentence. He opened the door. The world was a wall of churning white. He couldn't see his hand in front of his face. Marin, he said, to no one. The dread was a physical sickness now. He would die if he stayed. He would die if he went. But if he stayed, he would be a coward. He pulled his hat down low, wrapped his scarf over his face, and pushed his way through the gathering drift to the terrified, stamping roan. In the O'Hara cabin, Marin was in a world of pure, focused agony. She had spread her cleanest blanket on her bed of boughs. The pot of water was boiling on the stove, steaming the small, frozen windows. The stack of flannel was within reach. She had done everything right, but she was utterly, terrifyingly alone. She paced the small floor, her body no longer her own. It was a vessel for this overwhelming, agonizing work. With every contraction, the cabin itself seemed to cry out, the wind shrieking in sympathy, the logs groaning as if they, too, were being ripped apart. She grabbed a piece of thick leather, a strap she used for binding wood, and held it between her teeth. Judah's ride was a blind, brutal fight. There was no trail. There was no direction. There was only up and down, and the solid, suffocating presence of the snow. The wind tore at him, trying to rip him from the saddle. The roan, a brave and steady horse, was panicked, fighting for its head, its breath coming in great, terrified plumes. Judah gave the horse its rein, trusting its instinct over his own, praying it would keep to the ridge and not stumble into a drift. He had his scarf wrapped around his face, but the snow, fine and sharp as ground glass, still found its way in, stinging his eyes, freezing his eyelashes shut. He was moving, but he had no idea where he was. He could have been riding in circles. He could have been 5 minutes from the cabin or 5 miles. Then, the ground beneath the roan simply vanished. It wasn't a cliff. It was an ice-covered creek bed, hidden by a deep drift of new snow. The horse's front legs punched through the ice. The animal screamed a high, terrible sound that was swallowed by the storm. Judah was thrown, flying clear of the saddle, and he hit the opposite bank with a force that knocked the air from his lungs. He felt a sickening, wet pop in his left shoulder, followed by a wave of white-hot, blinding agony that eclipsed the cold. He lay in the snow, his vision graying at the edges, the pain in his shoulder so vast it was his entire world. The horse was thrashing, its leg caught in the ice, its screams muffled by the snow. Judah tried to move, to get to his rifle, to put the animal out of its misery, but the movement sent a fresh wave of fire through his arm. His left arm was useless, hanging at a strange, unnatural angle. The horse's cries stopped. It was either free or it was gone, swallowed by the snow and the drift. Judah was alone. He had no horse. He was miles from the cabin, and he was injured badly. He dragged himself to his feet, his teeth clamped shut against a groan. The cold, which had been a threat, was now a predator. It sank its teeth into him, into his wet clothes, into his injured shoulder. He would be dead in an hour. Marin. The thought was a compass. It was the only thing in the white, howling void. He looked around, blind, and his hand brushed against a small pine. He ripped a long, dead branch from its trunk. He jammed it into the snow. It held. He pulled himself forward. He began to walk. It was not walking. It was a kind of slow, agonizing drowning. The snow was up to his waist, a heavy, clinging powder that fought every step. He used the branch as a staff, jamming it in, leaning his full weight on it, dragging his useless arm and his frozen legs forward. He made a sound with every step, a low, animal grunt of exertion and pain. His breath was a ragged plume of steam. freezing instantly to his beard. He had one focus: cabin. And simply, keep moving. Marin had lost all track of time. It was her and the pain and the wind. She was lying on the blanket, her body slick with sweat despite the cold. She was exhausted, her strength fading. She felt a moment of pure, black despair. She was going to die here, alone. She and the baby. Both. No. The resolve that had felled the trees, that had raised the walls, flared up. She had not come this far to be beaten by a storm or her own body. She gripped the leather strap in her teeth, and as the next wave hit, she bore down, roaring into the wind, her voice joining the storm's fury. The world narrowed to a single, tearing point of impossible pressure, and she pushed through it. And then sudden, shocking release, silence. The wind howled, but inside, the pain was gone. For a terrible, breathless second, there was no other sound. Then, a thin, reedy cry, like a snowbird. She gasped, relief hitting her so hard it felt like another contraction. She pulled the small, slippery body up to her chest. It was a girl, a perfect, tiny, red-faced, screaming girl. "Oh," Marin wept, the tears freezing on her cheeks. "Oh, you're here, you're here." She wiped the baby clean with a flannel cloth, her hands no longer shaking, but moving with a sure, steady purpose. She wrapped the baby in the driest, warmest wool she had. "Linnet," she whispered, her voice a raw croak. "Like a little bird, my little linnet." She was holding the child to her, the baby's cries already quieting. When the door crashed open, it did not open. It burst from its latch, as if struck by a battering ram. A figure, a specter made of ice and snow, fell across the threshold. G sprawling onto the wooden floor. Marin screamed, clutching the baby. The figure groaned and tried to move. It was Judah. He was a nightmare. His face was a mask of rime. His lips a dark, frightening shade of purple. His left arm was held at a terrible angle against his chest, and the sleeve of his coat was dark, stained with blood from the torn joint. He had no hat, and his hair was frozen solid. He had collapsed, and he was not getting up. A new, frantic adrenaline surged through Marin, overriding the exhaustion of childbirth. She laid Linnet in the small, hastily made box cradle near the stove, piling blankets around her. "Stay warm," she commanded, her voice fierce. She went to Judah. He was unconscious, his breathing shallow, his body already stiffening. He was a block of ice. "Judah," she shook his good shoulder. "Judah, you cannot do this." He was too heavy. She was too weak. She couldn't lift him. "You will not die on my floor. Judah Renshaw," she sobbed, her voice breaking. She grabbed him under his arms and pulled, using her legs, her entire body. Her post-childbirth agony lost in the new panic, she dragged him, inch by agonizing inch, across the floor until he was in front of the stove. She ripped his frozen coat open. The shoulder was a mess, swollen and unnaturally angled, the joint clearly dislocated, the skin broken and dark. She worked with a grim, focused desperation. She stripped his wet clothes off, his skin a deathly, mottled white. She rubbed his hands, his face, his chest with the bear grease she kept for waterproofing boots. The smell, sharp and pungent. She found 2 flat pieces of kindling and the roll of flannel strips she had torn for bandages. She set his arm as best she could, splinting it tightly against his chest to keep it immobile. Finally. She rolled him onto her last dry blanket and covered him with her own, still warm from her labor. She collapsed beside him, her body finally surrendering. She was bleeding, she was aching, she was exhausted to her very soul. Outside, the storm raged. Inside, the fire hissed. The baby began to cry. The cry, thin and insistent, cut through Judah's frozen fog. His eyes snapped open. They were hazy, unfocused. "Marin," he rasped, his voice a dry crackle. "I'm here," Marin said, her voice trembling. "I'm here." His gaze shifted, trying to find the sound. He saw the box. He saw the small, moving bundle. "The baby! She's here!" Marin wept, crawling to the cradle and lifting the child. She brought Linnet over, kneeling by Judah's side. "She's here! A girl!" Judah looked at the child. His face, frozen and bruised, softened. The pain, the cold, the agonizing walk, it all faded. He saw this tiny, perfect, impossible life, breathing in the cabin he had helped build. He lifted his right hand, his fingers raw and stiff. He reached out, his hand shaking, and gently, so gently, he touched the baby's cheek with one finger. He felt the impossible softness, the warmth. He looked at Marin, his eyes clear for the first time. He saw her, her face stained with tears and smoke, her hair wild, her body wrapped in a single blanket. He saw the strength that had just conquered death twice in one night. A slow, pained smile touched his cracked lips. "Marin," he whispered, his voice gaining a thread of its old strength, If you'll both have me." He took a breath, the effort costing him. "I'm staying." He didn't say, "I love you." He didn't propose. It was a simple, profound statement of fact, a vow. "I'm staying for good." Marin didn't answer. She couldn't speak. She just knelt there, holding her daughter, her tears falling hot on the baby's blanket. Outside, the blizzard howled, trying to tear their small world apart. It had failed. Inside, warmed by the small, defiant glow of the iron stove, a family, forged not by law but by will, had just been born. The storm passed in the deep hours of the night, its fury spent. In its wake, it left a silence so profound it felt like a physical presence, a thick, soft blanket of peace covering the world. Outside, the landscape was a dream of white and blue, under a sky scrubbed clean and littered with cold, diamond-hard stars. Inside the O'Hara cabin, the only sounds were the soft, rhythmic hiss of the fire in the stove, the gentle whisper of a draft against the window pane, and the quiet, impossibly precious sound of a newborn baby breathing. Marin sat on the stool by the hearth. The world shrunk to the small, warm bundle in her arms. Linnet was asleep, her tiny face serene, her mouth a perfect miniature bow. Marin couldn't stop looking at her. She traced the impossibly fine line of her daughter's eyebrow with a finger, felt the feather-light puff of her breath against her knuckle. This small, warm, living creature was the reason for every blister, every aching muscle, every moment of fear. She was the foundation, the roof, the entire purpose of the house. Across from her, propped carefully in the chair he had built, sat Judah. He was awake, his good arm resting on his knee, his injured one bound tightly to his chest. The pain was etched in the lines around his eyes, but beneath it was a deep, quiet warmth that seemed to emanate from him, adding to the heat from the stove. His gaze was not on the fire, but on her and the child. He was watching over them, a silent, unmovable guardian. He had been given a blanket, and his clothes, now dry, were folded neatly beside him. He was a man stripped of his birthright, a guest in the house he had saved, and yet he seemed more at home than Marin had ever seen him. The hours had passed in a haze of exhaustion and wonder. They had spoken little, their communication a series of quiet questions and reassurances. He had told her where he'd left the last of his supplies, a small bag of dried jerky and hardtack, and she had made a weak broth, which they'd shared. She had tended to the baby, her movements slow and aching, but driven by an instinct so powerful it eclipsed her own pain. She was a mother. The word felt strange and vast and absolutely true. Now, in the deep well of the night, with the adrenaline faded and only the bone-deep exhaustion remaining, a new feeling began to surface. It was fear, a cold, creeping terror that felt like the ghost of the storm, slipping in through the chinked logs. She had survived. The baby had survived. Judah had survived. But survival was a temporary state. The world, with its laws and its judgments and its Lillian Ainsworths, was still out there, buried for now, but waiting. And Percival Dane was still out there, a name on a piece of paper that gave him a claim to her, and to this child. She was still alone, in the ways that mattered most. She looked at Judah, at his steady presence in the firelight. He had given up everything to stand with her, but he was a man, and men could leave. One already had. The thought was a shard of ice in her gut. Her voice, when she spoke, was a bare whisper, so quiet she was not sure she had said it aloud. "I need you, tonight." The words hung in the warm, still air. They were words that could be misunderstood, words that in another time, another place, would have carried a different weight entirely. Judah's gaze sharpened, but he did not move. He simply waited, listening not just to the words, but to the profound, aching need beneath them. He heard the plea not for a lover, but for an anchor. He saw the terror in her eyes, the exhaustion of a soldier after a battle who is afraid to close her eyes for fear the enemy will return. He rose from the chair, a slow, careful movement that cost him a visible wince of pain from his shoulder. He did not come directly to her. He went to the wall where her coat hung and took it down. He walked over to her, his shadow large and protective in the firelight. She flinched, a small, involuntary movement, as he reached toward her. His hand stopped. His eyes, dark and serious, asked a silent question, a request for permission to enter her space. She gave a tiny, almost imperceptible nod. His hand, the one that was chapped and calloused and strong, came up to her hair, gently, with a tenderness that made her throat tighten. His fingers brushed at a few stray flakes of snow that were still clinging to a loose strand by her temple, remnants of the blizzard that had brought him to her door. It was the same gesture he might have used on a frightened colt, a movement of pure, gentle reassurance. "I'm here," he said, his voice a low rumble. He took the stool she had been using and set it next to her own, so close their knees were almost touching. He sat, and the space between them shrank, filled with a shared warmth. She watched as he reached for her free hand, the one not supporting the baby. He held it, turning it over to look at the palm, a map of her struggle, the blisters, the calluses, the splinters. He didn't say anything. He simply enclosed it in both of his warmth seeping into her cold fingers. The simple, silent contact was her undoing. A single, hot tear escaped her and traced a path down her cheek. She leaned forward, the movement slow and aching, and rested her forehead against the solid bulk of his good shoulder. She closed her eyes. She could feel the steady, rhythmic beat of his heart through the layers of his shirt and her own exhaustion. It was a slow, strong, dependable rhythm, the sound of a man who was not going to run. She breathed in, and her breath was a shudder. She could smell the faint scent of pine smoke and wet wool that clung to him, the scent of the wilderness and of honest labor. He breathed out, and she felt the warmth of his breath stir her hair. Their breathing began to fall into the same rhythm, a quiet, unconscious harmony. He shifted slightly, using his good arm to drape her own worn coat around her shoulders, pulling it snug, cocooning her in a small, safe pocket of warmth. "I'm so afraid," she whispered against his shoulder, the confession muffled by the rough fabric. "I'm so afraid that I'll be left again." Judah did not answer with promises. He knew, with a wisdom born of his own loss, that words were cheap things, easily broken. Instead, he answered with an action. He gently released her hand. He stood, picked up his chair, and moved it to the other side of her, placing it directly between her and the cradle. He sat down again, a sentinel now, guarding not just her, but the child. The simple, deliberate movement was a declaration, clearer than any vow. "I am here. I am on the line. I am not passing through. I am standing my ground right here, with you both." She lifted her head, her tear-filled eyes meeting his. The firelight danced in their depths, and what she saw there was not pity, not duty, but a deep and unwavering resolve. He leaned toward her, his movements slow, giving her every chance to turn away. He gently cupped her chin with his warm, rough hand, tilting her face up to his. The kiss was not one of passion. It was a kiss of profound tenderness, a gesture of sealing a sacred, unspoken pact. It was slow and soft and brief. It tasted of wood smoke and snow and a shared, desperate survival. For a moment, his lips rested against hers, a silent promise. And then he drew back. He looked at her, his thumb stroking her jawline, his eyes saying everything his words did not need to. Her own lips trembled slightly, not with fear, but with the shock of a kindness so pure it was almost painful. She leaned into him again, and this time, he put his good arm around her, pulling her close. They sat side by side, their backs resting against the solid, fragrant pine wall they had raised together. The intimacy between them was not one of heat, but of a deep and peaceful quiet. It was the comfort of two weary travelers who had found a safe harbor in a storm. The passion was not in their lips, but in their hands. She reached for his hand again, and their fingers intertwined. Her grip, as fierce and desperate as his, was strong and reassuring. They were not just holding hands, they were holding on. She let out a long, slow sigh, the tension that had held her rigid for months finally beginning to unspool, the aches of childbirth, the fear of the future, the ghost of Percival. It was all still there, but it was no longer hers to carry alone. She felt the heavy weight of sleep pulling at her, an exhaustion so complete it was like a tide. Her head grew heavy on his shoulder. "Sleep, Marin," he whispered, his voice close to her ear. "I'll watch the fire." Her last conscious thought was of the steady, even beat of his heart, a lullaby of safety and strength. She slept. Judah sat in the quiet cabin, the woman he loved and the child he had already claimed as his own sleeping beside him. The firelight cast long, dancing shadows on the walls. He looked down at Marin's face, peaceful in sleep. The lines of fear and worry smoothed away. He felt a surge of protectiveness so fierce it was a physical ache in his chest, rivaling the pain in his shoulder. This was it. This was the thing he had been missing, the thing he had thought lost forever with Sarah. It wasn't a ranch or a name. It was this small, warm room, this woman, this child. He looked over at the cradle, at the small, perfect miracle sleeping there. He kept his voice to a low, rumbling whisper so as not to wake Marin. "You know," he murmured to the sleeping baby, "the sandhill cranes, they fly over this valley in the spring. They come from a long way south. They fly in a line, and they call to each other the whole way. It's a sound. It sounds like old trumpets. They say they mate for life. They find their partner, and they stay. Through storms and long winters. They just stay." He fell silent, watching the flames. He gently tightened his grip on Marin's hand. Love, he was discovering, wasn't a sudden fire. It wasn't a grand declaration. It was built, slowly, deliberately, like a cabin in a storm. One log at a time, one shared meal, one moment of terror, one night spent standing watch. It was a slow, quiet, and unbreakable thing. And it was just beginning. The thaw came in January, a fall spring that turned the world to mud and dripping water. It was a time of gray skies and gray slush, but inside the cabin, there was warmth and life. Lynette was a month old, then 2. She was a healthy, thriving baby who had her mother's startling blue eyes and a grip that was as surprisingly strong as Judah's. Life settled into a routine of survival and quiet domesticity. Marin's body healed, her strength returned, transformed now into the steady, enduring power of a mother. Judah's shoulder, though permanently stiff, was functional. He hunted, he split wood, he kept the small world of the O'Hara cabin safe and supplied. The legal line between them remained, a clear and respected boundary, but in every other way. They had become a family. The mail rider, a grizzled man who only made it up to the bluff when the trails were passable, brought the letter from Helena in early March. It was from Eliab Fitch, attorney at law. Marin opened it with trembling fingers, Judah standing behind her, his hand resting on her shoulder, a silent, solid presence. The lawyer's script was a spare, spidery thing, as practical and unadorned as the frontier itself. The law, he explained, was simple but unbending. For a divorce on grounds of desertion, the territory of Montana required one of two things: the signed consent of the abandoning party, or irrefutable proof of said abandonment, presented to the circuit judge, Mr. Fitch noted that obtaining a signature from a man in Boston would be difficult. He suggested the alternative, a legal process known as notice by posting, wherein a summons would be tacked to the courthouse door. If the husband did not appear to contest it after a set period, a judgment could be made in his absence. It was a slow, public, and uncertain path, but it was a path. The letter laid a chill over the warm cabin. The fight was no longer a distant, abstract thing. It now had rules and procedures, and a name, Percival Dane. 2 weeks later, as if summoned by the lawyer's ink, he appeared. He did not arrive on horseback, caked in the honest mud of the trail. He arrived in a hired buggy from the town's livery, a light, flimsy vehicle wholly unsuited to the rutted track. He wore a tailored city coat of dark wool, polished boots that were already ruined by the mud, and a sneer of condescending distaste for the entire landscape. He was handsome, in a sharp, brittle way, his features fine and his eyes a pale, cold gray. Behind him, on a saddle horse, rode another man, a hulking, silent figure with a flattened nose and the kind of dead-eyed stare that advertised a capacity for uncomplicated violence. Marin was outside, hanging Lynette's diapers on a line strung between two pines. When the buggy pulled up, her heart seized in her chest. A fist of pure, cold ice. She had dreamed of this moment, had nightmares about it, but the reality was somehow more shocking, more banal. He was just a man, a well-dressed man who was looking at her cabin as if it were an unpleasant smell. Judah came out of the cabin, drawn by the sound. He moved to stand beside her, not in front of her. He carried no weapon, but his presence was a shield, his body a solid line drawn in the mud. Percival Dane climbed down from the buggy, stepping gingerly around a puddle. He took in the scene Marin, her hair tied back in a simple scarf, her dress clean but patched, the rough-hewn cabin, the hulking, quiet man standing beside her. A slow, mocking smile spread across his face. "Well, well, Marin," he said, his voice carrying the clipped, superior accent of Boston. "It seems the rustic life agrees with you. You've nested." His eyes flickered to the clothesline, to the tiny flannel squares, and his smile tightened. "What do you want? Percival?" Marin's voice was steady, a miracle she hadn't known she possessed. "What do I want?" He feigned surprise. "Why, I received a rather curious piece of mail, forwarded from my club. It had the scent of desperation and cheap ink. Something about a divorce in this godforsaken territory." He took a step closer, his gaze sweeping over Judah. "And I see you've acquired a local furnishing. Sturdy." Judah didn't react to the jibe. He simply watched, his dark eyes missing nothing. "You left," Marin said, the words flat and hard. "The divorce is a formality." "Ah, but formalities are the very glue of civilization, my dear." Percival purred. He reached into his coat and produced a folded document. "This, however, could expedite things. It's my signature, on a simple document of consent, a clean break. It will save you the embarrassment of a public spectacle." He held it out, then snatched it back as she instinctively reached for it. "Of course," he said, his voice turning oily. "My signature has value. My time has value. My good name, which you are so determined to tarnish by living in this squalor, has considerable value. $1,000. Marin, A small price to pay to be free of me. Wouldn't you say? The hired man behind him shifted, his hand resting on the butt of a pistol tucked into his belt. The threat was no longer veiled. That's blackmail, Judah said, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. I call it a settlement, Percival countered smoothly. She has something of mine, my name. I am simply selling it back to her. Marin looked at the man she had once thought she loved. She saw him clearly now, a creature of surfaces and transactions, a man whose honor was a commodity to be bought and sold. The fear that had held her captive for a year finally broke, washed away by a tide of pure, clarifying contempt. She took a step forward, away from the protection of Judah's presence. She met her husband's cold gaze. I will settle this debt with the truth before a notary. Mr. Dane, she said, her voice ringing with a cold, clear authority. I will not pay for lies. Now, you will take your assumptions and your threats, and you will get off my land. Percival stared at her, genuinely shocked. This was not the frightened, weeping girl he had abandoned. This was someone else. You'll regret this, he hissed. By the time I'm done telling this town what you are, you won't be able to buy a sack of flour. This is not Boston, Judah said, his voice cutting through the tension. Your kind of currency isn't worth much here. The porch is this way. He gestured with his chin toward the muddy track. It was a calm, final, and absolute dismissal. Percival, his face a mask of fury, climbed back into his buggy. You've been warned. He spat, and the driver whipped the horse, the buggy lurching away. That afternoon, in town, Lillian Ainsworth was leaving the dressmaker's shop when she saw Percival Dane step out of the hotel. She recognized his type instantly, the fine tailoring, the arrogant posture, the air of a man who believed the world was his private club. He was arguing with the livery owner, his voice raised in complaint about the state of the buggy. Lillian watched, her intelligent eyes taking in every detail. This man, so obviously from the East, so clearly a man of money and temper, did not fit the story the gossips told. He did not look like a heartbroken husband searching for his lost wife. He looked like a predator. For the first time, a fissure of doubt appeared in the smooth facade of her certainty. The next day, Elias Renshaw rode up to the cabin. He dismounted, his face a thundercloud. He ignored Marin completely, his gaze fixed on his son. I gave you a choice, boy. He boomed. I told you what would happen if you came back to this stain on the valley. Now it's worse. Henry Ainsworth told me a man from Boston is in town, claiming that woman is his wife. A married woman. You've shamed us all. I am giving you one last chance. Leave her. Come home. I will tell them you were deceived. I will salvage the Renshaw name. Judah stood on the porch he had built, his feet planted. He looked at his father, the man whose approval he had sought his entire life, and he felt nothing but a deep, weary pity. I already made my choice. Father, Judah said, his voice quiet but unbending. He glanced back into the cabin, where Marin was rocking Linnet, her face pale but resolute. You see a scandal. I see a woman who built her own home while carrying a child. You see shame. I see a woman who would rather face down a blackmailer than pay $1 for a lie. He looked his father directly in the eye. So you can keep your name. I'll choose the person who's shivering from the cold, but not from telling the truth. Elias Renshaw stared, his mouth working, but no words came out. He had no answer for that. He turned, climbed onto his horse with the stiff movements of an old, angry man, and rode away for the last time. The battle was now a legal one. Marin wrote another letter to Eliab Fitch, detailing Percival's arrival and his demand. The lawyer's reply was swift. They would build an affidavit. They would gather proof. Marin spent the next week writing. She wrote to the doctor in Boston who had confirmed her pregnancy. She wrote to her former landlady, Mrs. Gable, a stern but fair woman. asking for a witness statement about the date Percival had left and the state Marin had been in. And she took out the one piece of evidence she had guarded for a year, the note Percival had left. It was brief, cold, and damningly vague. Speaking of business, with no mention of return, she would have it all notarized by the circuit judge when he came through. Percival, finding no purchase with his threats at the cabin, took his campaign to the town. He spent his time in the saloon, buying drinks and telling his version of the story, a tale of a flighty, unfaithful wife who had run off, leaving him heartbroken. Some men listened, eager for the drama, but others, men who had seen Judah Renshaw's quiet integrity for years, who had watched Marin's cabin rise log by log, were not so easily swayed. The confrontation came to a head on a Sunday, after the service, as the congregation milled outside the small white church. Percival Dane approached Marin and Judah. He had been drinking. "There she is," he announced, his voice loud enough for everyone to hear. "The devoted wife, praying for forgiveness for her sins. I have no doubt." The townspeople froze. This was the drama they had been whispering about, now laid bare on the church steps. Marin clutched Lynette, who was bundled in her arms, and refused to answer. Judah stepped slightly in front of her. "This is not the place. Dane!" "Oh, I think it's the perfect place," Percival sneered. "Amongst God-fearing people, they should know who they have in their midst." It was then that Lillian Ainsworth, who had been standing with her father, stepped forward. Her face was calm, her posture erect. She was the undisputed queen of this small society, and when she spoke, everyone listened. "I believe," she said, her voice clear and cutting, "that God-fearing people are also discerning people. Mr. Dane, they can tell the difference between a man of honor and a man who makes a scene on the steps of a church." She looked directly at Percival, her eyes cold. "I myself witnessed you at the hotel, shouting at the staff. It was not the behavior of a gentleman." A collective gasp went through the crowd. Lillian Ainsworth was, in a way, defending the woman who had taken her fiancé. Lillian's gaze shifted to the circuit judge, a weary, whiskered man who had attended the service. "Judge Parker," she said, "I believe this woman," she gestured toward Marin, "has a petition to file, and I believe this man's public behavior may serve as evidence toward her claim of his character." It was a masterstroke of strategy, delivered with icy composure. Lillian had not taken a side. She had taken the side of public decency and the truth. She had seen Percival's dishonor, and it had offended her own rigid code. Judge Parker looked from Percival's flushed, angry face to Marin's pale, determined one. He looked at Judah, standing like a mountain beside her. He looked at Lillian, whose word was as good as gold in this town. "The court will hear petitions at the town hall tomorrow morning at 9, the judge announced, his voice tired but firm. He looked pointedly at Percival. "I suggest all parties conduct themselves with decorum until then." The crowd broke apart. Murmuring, Percival was left standing alone, his face a picture of thwarted rage. The community had seen the contrast, the hard, honest work of the cabin on the bluff, and the loud, empty threats of the man from the city. The next morning, Marin presented her affidavit, her letters, and Percival's note. Lillian Ainsworth gave a brief, factual statement about Percival's public behavior. Percival, through a lawyer he had hired, denied everything and repeated his demands for a settlement. Judge Parker listened to it all, his eyes half closed. When they were finished, he looked at the papers. "This is Montana territory. Mr. Dane," he said. "We don't have much time for parlor games. The petitioner has provided evidence of desertion. You have provided bluster. The motion for a notice by posting is granted. A summons will be affixed to the courthouse door for 90 days. If you fail to formally contest it with evidence of your own in that time, a divorce will be granted by default." He banged a small gavel. Marin stood, her legs shaking. It was not over. But a door, a heavy iron-bound door, had just been pushed open a crack, and through it she could feel the first faint breath of freedom. The 90-day period set by Judge Parker began to crawl by. It was a time of nervous, brittle quiet. The snows of the high passes melted, and the creek that gave the bluff its name swelled into a muddy, churning roar. Percival Dane, released on his own recognizance but ordered to remain in the territory, was a toxic presence in bitter Juniper Creek. He was a man humiliated, and a man like that, with money and no morals, was a cougar backed into a corner quiet, patient, and waiting to strike. Judah felt it. He and Marin had moved back into the cabin, but the peace was gone. He took to carrying his rifle with him, even just to check the new snares he'd set. He didn't trust the silence. He was right to. The attack, when it came, was not on Marin or the cabin. It was an act of calculated, impersonal cruelty, aimed at the heart of the valley. Percival had learned what mattered most to these people, not their names, but their livelihoods. It was a dry, windy night, the kind of night when the air itself feels thin and flammable. Marin was nursing Linnet, the cabin warm and peaceful, the baby's small hand clutching her finger. Judah was standing by the open door, looking out into the darkness. "Winds from the east," he said, his voice a low rumble of unease. "It's too dry. Fire weather." As if the words had summoned it, he stiffened. "Marin, do you smell that?" She sniffed. It was not the clean, resinous scent of pine. It was the acrid, choking smell of burning hay, and something else, something foul. Kerosene. Judah stepped out onto the porch. He looked north, up toward Ash Needle Ridge, and his blood ran cold. The horizon was not dark. It was a sickening, pulsing orange. A column of black, greasy smoke was boiling into the starlit sky, illuminated from below by a terrible, hungry light. "The double bar R," he whispered. It was not a guess. It was a certainty. The main barn. Before Marin could say a word, he was moving. He grabbed his heavy coat and his hat. He didn't go for the rifle. There was no one to shoot. There was only one thing to do. He ran to the small lean-to where he kept the mule he'd bought from a passing trader, throwing a bridle on it with frantic, practiced hands. "Judah, no!" Marin cried, coming to the door with Linnet in her arms. "Your father!" "The horses!" he said, his voice a raw rasp. He swung himself onto the mule's back. "The horses are in that barn." He didn't look back. He kicked the mule into a desperate, scrambling run down the muddy track. A man possessed, riding not to his inheritance, but to his duty. Marin stood for a frozen second, her heart hammering. The man who had paid for this, Percival, was a monster. But the man who had done it, the silent, hulking brute, was an animal. And that animal had just started a war. She would not huddle in fear. This was not just Judah's father's ranch. This was his home. This was the valley. This was her fight, too. She moved with a frantic, cold purpose. She wrapped Linnet in every blanket she had, placing her tenderly in the wooden box. She ran outside and hitched the mule's harness to the Kowalski's heavy work sled. She placed the box securely in the sled bed, lashing it down. "Hold on, little bird," she whispered. "We're going to help your father." She grabbed the reins and plunged into the darkness, following the terrible glow in the sky. When Judah reached the ridge, it was a vision from hell. The great cathedral-like barn of the Double Bar R was an inferno. The dry wind was whipping the flames into a roaring vortex, carrying burning chunks of hay and shingles into the night, starting smaller fires in the dry grass. Ranch hands, his father's men, were running ineffectually, shouting, their faces lit with orange panic. And at the center of it all, standing alone by the water trough, as if turned to stone, was Elias Renshaw. He was just watching his life's work go up in smoke. But Judah didn't see his father. He heard the screaming. It was a sound he knew in his bones, the high, terrified, throat-tearing screams of horses trapped in a fire. He saw Calloway, the foreman, trying to unlatch the main doors, but the heat drove him back. "The stock!" Judah roared, leaping from the mule. "Are they out?" "Can't get 'em. Judah!" Calloway yelled, his face black with soot. "The doors are barred, and the side latches, it's jammed. The heat's warped it." Judah didn't hesitate. He wrapped his coat tighter around his arm and ran straight for the smaller side door. He kicked it open and plunged into the blinding, choking smoke. It was like stepping into a furnace. The air was a solid, searing thing. He could see the horses, their eyes white with terror, rearing and kicking in their stalls, the smoke so thick he was already choking. "Come on, boys," he bellowed, his voice cracking. He ran to the first stall, unlatched it, and slapped the stallion on the rump. "Go, go!" The horse bolted, a dark shape against the flames. He moved to the next, and the next. He was working with his good right arm, his left shoulder a screaming protest. He got to the last stall, where his father's prized thoroughbred mare was climbing the walls in panic. The latch was hot, searing his hand, but he got it open. He grabbed the mare's halter. "Easy, girl, easy." He was pulling her toward the door when a sound like a freight train filled the air. A massive crossbeam, eaten through by the fire, groaned above him. He didn't have time to think. With a desperate, agonizing roar, he shoved the mare with his entire body, using his bad shoulder as a battering ram. He felt the sickening, familiar tear as ligaments and old wounds ripped apart. The pain was a white-hot knife in his back, but the mare shot forward, out the door. He dove after her, rolling into the mud and ash as the entire section of the roof collapsed behind him, sending a volcanic eruption of sparks and embers into the night. He lay on the ground, his body screaming, his shoulder a useless, fiery agony, but the horses were out. It was then that Marin arrived, the sled sliding to a halt in the yard. The scene was chaos. She saw figures running, silhouetted against the flames. She saw the Kowalski family, Stefan and Maria, already there. Maria saw her and ran over. Marin didn't wait to be asked. She leaped from the sled, unlashed the box, and thrust the sleeping baby into Maria's arms. "Take her," she commanded, her voice fierce. "Keep her away. Keep her safe." Maria nodded, her eyes wide with terror, and hurried the baby back to the safety of her own wagon, far from the embers. Marin turned, her fear for Linnet replaced by a new, sharp terror. Where was Judah? She saw him, staggering to his feet. He was covered in soot, his left arm hanging limp, but he wasn't running from the fire. He was running to it. He was heading for the huge, sliding doors of the attached stable, where the yearlings were kept. "Judah!" she screamed. He and Calloway were trying to heave the massive wooden door, but it was jammed, its track warped by the heat. "It's no good," Calloway choked, his lungs full of smoke. Judah put his one good shoulder to the wood and pushed, his face a mask of agony, but the door didn't budge. Marin didn't think. She ran. She put her shoulder right next to his. "Marin, get back!" he roared, but she ignored him. "On 3, she gasped, her hands gripping the hot wood. 1, 2, 3, she shoved, heaving with a strength she did not know she possessed. It was the strength that had lifted logs, the strength that had pushed a child into the world. It was the strength of a mother, a wife in all but name, and it was absolute. The door groaned, splintered, and then ripped from its burning track, falling to the ground with a crash. A half-dozen terrified young horses bolted from the smoke, galloping into the night. Elias Renshaw, who had been moving in a daze, stopped. He saw it all. He saw his disowned son, his shoulder clearly ruined, stumble from the inferno, and he saw the woman, the Boston scandal, the source of his shame, her hair wild, her face black with soot, put her own body against the burning wood to save his son and his stock. He watched her, this woman he had despised, and for the first time in his rigid, unbending life, the iron in his gaze softened. It cracked like ice under a spring sun. The yard was full now. The light had been seen for miles. Wagons and riders were pouring in, and at their head was Lillian Ainsworth. She was not in a fine dress. She wore a man's coat over her nightdress, her hair in a long braid. She was not panicking. She was commanding. "Bucket Brigade!" she shouted, her voice cutting through the roar. "To the trough, Stefan! You and your boys! To the well! We can't save the barn! Protect the house!" In an instant, the town became an army. The divisions, the gossip, the judgments, all of it dissolved, burned away by the heat. Mrs. Pendergast stood shoulder to shoulder with Maria Kowalski, passing buckets. Henry Ainsworth, Lillian's father, worked alongside Elias Renshaw. Their feud over cattle contracts forgotten. They were a single, desperate line of humanity, fighting the flames. Judah, his work done, finally succumbed. The smoke, the pain, the exhaustion. He staggered, his vision tunneling. He went to his knees. Marin was there in a second. She caught him, easing him down to the ground. She knelt in the mud and ash, pulling his head onto her lap. The firelight flicked across their faces. He was gasping, his eyes rolling back. "No," she whispered, her voice fierce, holding his face between her sooty hands. "No, Judah, look at me." His eyes focused on hers, finding her in the chaos. "Don't you dare give up," she commanded him, her voice thick with love and terror. "We are not done. Do you hear me? We are not done." He managed a nod, his good hand finding hers, and he held on. The fight lasted until dawn. When the sun finally rose, it revealed a scene of utter devastation. The main barn was a smoking, blackened skeleton, but the house was untouched, and in a far pasture, huddled together, were the horses. Every single one was alive. The people of the valley stood in the gray light, their faces streaked with soot and sweat, their bodies aching. They looked at each other, and the soot on their faces was like a shared mark, a silent oath. They had faced the fire, and they had done it together. The sheriff, who had been passing buckets with the rest, walked to the origin point of the fire, his face grim. "This was no accident," he said, kicking at a blackened can. "Kerosene, and—" He bent down, pointing to the mud near the foundation. "Tracks, not a rancher's boot, a city boot, narrow heel." Calloway stepped forward. "I saw a man, sheriff, when I first smelled the smoke, running toward the creek trail." The sheriff, another man, and Calloway mounted up. They followed the tracks, made clear in the mud of the creek bed. They led straight to the livery in Bitter Juniper Creek, straight to the hotel. They found Percival's henchman in his room, his bag packed, his city boots, sitting by the door, were caked in mud and ash. The distinctive narrow heel a perfect match. The room stank of kerosene. The man saw the sheriff, and his dead-eyed expression broke into one of pure animal panic. He didn't even try to lie. "He paid me," the man blubbered, pointing down the hall toward Percival's room. "Mr. Dane, he said to send a message, said to burn the old man's legacy to the ground. He paid me gold." The sheriff didn't hesitate. They kicked open Percival's door. He was in his dressing gown, a look of smug satisfaction on his face that instantly turned to horror. "What is the meaning of this?" he demanded. "Percival Dane," the sheriff said, pulling out the cuffs. "You're under arrest for arson, for conspiracy, for attempted murder. You've burned down the wrong man's barn." Back at the ranch, Calloway was setting Judah's shoulder, a brutal, practical procedure that made Judah pass out for a moment. Marin, having retrieved a quiet, wide-eyed linnet from Maria, stood watching, her heart in her throat. Elias Renshaw, his face a gray mask of ash and exhaustion, walked over to her. He stood before her, a broken man, a man who had seen his world burn and be saved in the same night. He looked at Marin. He looked at the baby in her arms. He looked at his son, now stirring, his face pale with pain. Marin, he said, the name a rough, unfamiliar sound in his mouth. I have been a fool. He took a shuddering breath. I saw what I wanted to see. A problem. A scandal. He looked at the smoking ruin of his barn. Last night I stood there. I watched it burn. But you ran in. You and Judah. He met her eyes, and his were no longer ice. They were cracked and human, and filled with a terrible, clear light. I called you a scandal, he said, his voice a low growl of self-contempt. A scandal is a weak thing that breaks. But you're a king post. You're the main brace that holds the whole damned roof up. I was wrong. It was the only apology he knew how to give. It was more than enough. Later that day, the town council met in the shell-shocked saloon. But it wasn't a meeting. It was a reformation. Men who had been on opposite sides of the feud were now united. They spoke of rebuilding. They spoke of the law. They spoke of Percival Dane and the justice that would be served. And when they spoke of the fire, they spoke of the Renshaws, all of them. They spoke of Marin O'Hara, not as the woman from Boston, but as the woman who ran into the fire. The town, forged in the ashes, had been rebuilt, and Marin O'Hara, whether she knew it or not, was now one of its cornerstones. Spring came to the valley not as a gentle guest, but as a muddy, brawling conqueror. The snow retreated sullenly to the high peaks, and the creeks, swollen and brown, tore at their banks. For Coldwater Bluff, it was a season of rebuilding. The charred skeleton of the Double Bar R's great barn was torn down, and the air filled with the scent of fresh sawn lumber and the rhythmic sound of hammers as the community, forged into a single entity by the fire, raised a new one in its place. The 90-day notice period, tacked to the courthouse door, weathered in the spring sun, its ink fading. Percival Dane, his blackmail and arson schemes laid bare by his accomplice's terrified confession, sat in a cell awaiting the circuit judge's return, his Boston arrogance stripped away, leaving only a bitter, petty man whose currency had proven worthless. The final decree arrived on a bright, windy day in May. The mail rider brought it, a crisp, official envelope from Helena. Marin took it with a hand that did not tremble. She opened it inside the cabin, with Judah watching, his presence a silent, unwavering support. The legal language was dense and formal, but the final sentence was as clear and clean as the mountain air. It is hereby decreed that the marriage between Marin O'Hara and Percival Dane is dissolved. She read it twice. Then a third time, she was Marin O'Hara again. Not Marin Dane, the abandoned wife. Not the woman from Boston, the scandal on the bluff. She was simply Marin O'Hara. The name stood alone, unburdened, clean as a freshly planed board. She folded the paper and placed it in the small wooden box where she kept her most precious things, the deed to her land, a lock of Linnet's baby-fine hair, and the single dried petal of a wild rose Judah had once left on her doorstep. They did not have a wedding, a ceremony with a preacher and vows felt redundant. They had already made their vows, not with words, but with actions in the raising of a roof, in the face of a blizzard, in the smoke and terror of a fire. Instead, they chose to have what Marin called the Long Supper. On a mild Saturday evening, they laid planks across sawhorses in the clearing in front of the cabin, creating a long, rustic table. They covered it with a patchwork of borrowed tablecloths. Marin roasted a deer Judah had brought down, and Maria Kowalski arrived with a huge pot of potato dumplings and a crock of sour cream. Calloway, the foreman from the Double Bar R, brought a keg of beer. Others came, the men and women who had formed the Bucket Brigade, their faces clean now, but the memory of the shared fight still in their eyes. It was not a party. It was a gathering of a tribe, a quiet celebration of a community that had been tested by fire and had not been found wanting. As the sun began to dip behind the peaks, painting the sky in shades of rose and violet, two riders approached. It was Elias Renshaw, and beside him, Lillian Ainsworth. A hush fell over the long table. Elias dismounted, his movement still stiff with pride, but the hard, granite certainty was gone from his eyes. He walked not to Judah, but to Marin, who stood by the fire, holding linnet. He stopped before her, looking at the child, his grandchild. For a long, silent moment. "The new barn is framed," he said, his voice a rough rumble. It was not an apology. It was a report, a statement of continuity. He reached to his waist and unbuckled the heavy leather belt he had worn for 40 years. The buckle was made of hammered silver, a large, ornate thing bearing the iconic brand of the double-bar R. He held it out to Judah. "A man needs his own brand." Elias said it was everything. It was forgiveness. It was acceptance. It was the passing of a legacy. Judah took the belt, the leather worn and supple, the silver heavy with the weight of his family's history. He and his father looked at each other, and in that moment, the long, cold war between them was over. Lillian Ainsworth had watched this exchange, her face a mask of graceful composure. She walked over to Judah. She was, as always, beautiful, but a new, more somber wisdom had settled in her eyes. "Elias told me about the supper," she said, her voice quiet. "I just came to wish you well." She looked from Judah to Marin, a flicker of old pain and new respect in her gaze. "It seems my father's contracts are secure after all. He says the Renshaw name has never been more reliable." She held up her left hand. On her finger was the small, elegant diamond ring that had marked her as his intended. With a slow, deliberate movement, she pulled it off. She didn't offer it to him. She simply closed her own fingers around it and put it in her pocket. "You chose correctly, Judah," she said, her voice devoid of bitterness. It was a simple statement of fact. You chose the truth. Not many men do. She gave a small, sad smile, nodded to Marin, and walked back to her horse, a figure of lonely, unassailable dignity. The days settled into a new, more permanent rhythm, with the legal and social battles won. Judah turned his attention to the small details of their home. He spent an afternoon sifting through the cold ashes of the burned-out barn at the double-bar R. He came back not with anything of value, but with a single, twisted, fire-blackened horseshoe. He built a small forge in the clearing, and with Marin working the bellows, he heated the horseshoe until it glowed a furious, incandescent orange. He hammered it on a flat stone, the ringing of the steel a new kind of music in the valley. He bent it, shaped it, and polished it, not back into a shoe, but into a sturdy, beautifully curved handle. That evening, he fitted it to the new kitchen door he had just finished hanging in the cabin. It was a symbol, Marin knew, a testament to their life that which had been through the fire, broken and discarded, could be reshaped by will and work into something new, something useful, something that opened doors. That night, a late spring snow began to fall. Not a blizzard, but a gentle, hushing fall of thick, wet flakes. Linnet was asleep in her cradle, her breathing a soft, steady whisper. Marin sat at the table, the light of the oil lamp pooling on the last empty page of her journal. She dipped her pen in the ink. She did not write a letter to a lawyer or a landlady. She wrote a letter to herself. When she was done, she read it aloud, her voice soft but clear in the quiet cabin. Judah sat by the fire, mending a piece of harness, but she knew he was listening. "I am not Percival Dane's abandoned wife," she read. "I am not Boston's shame. I am not Coldwater Bluff's scandal. I am not the scar left by another man's choices. I am a woman who felled her own trees. I am a woman who faced a blizzard and brought forth life. I am the builder of the roof that shelters my daughter. My name is Marin O'Hara, and my honor is my own." She closed the journal. It was finished. She stood and walked to the window, watching the silent, hypnotic fall of the snow. The world was being made clean and new again. She felt Judah come to stand behind her. He didn't touch her, but she could feel his warmth, his steady, quiet presence. She turned to face him. The firelight flickered in his dark, steady eyes. All the fear, all the walls, all the legal, proper lines had been washed away, burned away. And all that was left was the simple, profound truth between them. She reached up and touched his face, her fingers tracing the rough line of his jaw. "I need you, tonight," she whispered. It was the same phrase she had whispered in the terror after the storm, but the meaning was transformed. It was no longer a plea for a guardian. It was a declaration from a free woman to the man she loved. It was a statement of want, not just need. Judah's hand came up to cover hers, pressing it to his cheek. He leaned in and touched his forehead to hers, a gesture of absolute reverence. He was a man who had walked through a blizzard for her, a man who had faced down his own father for her, and now he stood before her, his heart in his eyes, waiting for her lead. He took her hand and led her to the small open space in the middle of the room. He put his good arm around her waist, and she put her arms around his neck. There was no music. There was no need. The only sound was the crackle of the fire and the soft, steady rhythm of their own breathing. They began to move, a slow, swaying dance, their bodies fitting together as if they had been made for this. He lowered his head, and she lifted hers. The kiss was not the chaste, tender press of their first. It was deep and slow and sure, a culmination of every shared struggle, every unspoken word, every moment of terror and triumph. It was a kiss that tasted of wood smoke and winter, of freedom and forever. Their hands clasped, fingers intertwined, a perfect, unbreakable knot. Their breaths mingled, becoming one. The firelight cast their shadows on the log wall behind them, and as they held each other, the two shadows merged, becoming a single, whole, and unwavering form. A small, soft cry came from the cradle. It was not a sound of distress, but a gentle stirring, a small life announcing its presence. The kiss broke, but they did not move apart. Maren smiled, a look of pure, unadulterated joy on her face. Judah went to the cradle and lifted Lynette into his arms. The baby quieted instantly, her head nestling into the warm crook of his neck. He brought her over to Maren. He stood with his arm around his wife, holding their daughter. This was the ceremony. This was the sacrament. This was the moment their family, whole and complete, was truly consecrated. The next morning, Maren stood on the porch, breathing in the cold, clean air. The world was white and silent. Judah was standing on a stool, hammering something above the door. When he was done, he stepped down and stood beside her. She looked up. He had taken down the old sign. In its place was a new one, carved from a piece of weathered pine. The letters were not just carved. They had been burned into the wood with a hot iron. The black, stark letters, a permanent mark against the golden grain. O'Hara Renshaw Cabin, Coldwater Bluff. A gust of wind swirled down from the high peaks, carrying a fine dusting of snow. It settled in her hair, and Judah, just as he had on the very first day they met, reached out and gently brushed it away. She looked up at him, but this time she was not trembling from the cold. She was not braced against a hostile world. She was home. She reached out and laid her hand flat against his chest, right over his heart. She could feel its steady, powerful beat. "Home is here," she said, her voice soft but certain. He covered her hand with his own. Through the window behind them, the flames in the stove flared, and the whole cabin, their whole world, was bathed in a sudden, brilliant, and abiding warmth. Thank you for listening to our story. We'd love to know where in the world you're tuning in from, so please leave a comment below to share your thoughts and connect with fellow fans. If you enjoyed this tale, please subscribe to our channel. Wild West Stories 1850, give the video a like, and support us by hitting the hype button to help this story be heard by more people.